Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Chanukah. We'll be learning today Mir Hashem Daf Kuf Mem Vav Amud Aleph, and I hope a decent piece of Kuf Mem Vav Amud Beis as well. We begin today on Kuf Mem Vav Amud Aleph with a new siman Taf Reish Ayin Zayin Din Achsanoi B'Chanukah. The halachas that pertain to an Achsanoi, a guest on Chanukah. Ubay Dalet Seifim, and here we have 4 Seifim. Now, the siman is a very, very complex siman, and it requires a short little hakdama. The chiyuv of Neres Chanukah is a very, very interesting chiyuv. It seems clear from the Chazal and from the Rishonim that the chiyuv to light Neres Chanukah is not so much on an individual as much as it is on a household. Let's remember that the Iker mitzvah of Neres Chanukah is Ner Ish Ubeisai. What does that mean? That means that each household has to light Neres Chanukah. So automatically, when you take a look at the Iker Takanas Chazal, when you realize that the way Chazal were misaked this mitzvah, they said that each house needs to light one Ner, where? Outside the door of the house, so that there should be presuming Nisa to the Bnei Rishus Harabim. Now, if you take the Mahadran and the Mahadran Min Mahadran out of the picture, and you concentrate only on the Iker mitzvah of Neres Chanukah, automatically you see that the Chiv is not on individuals. You could have a household where there's a husband, a wife, and 6 kids. And all 6 kids might be Gedolim. Who's going to light the Neres Chanukah? Only the head of the household. Only the husband is going to light the Neres Chanukah. What does that mean for everybody else? Do they not have a chiyuv of Neres Chanukah? No, they do have a chiyuv of Neres Chanukah, but since they are members of a household, when the head of the household lights the menorah in the proper way at the proper time, he covers the chiyuv for all bnei beisai, for all the members of his household, for his wife, for his adult children, for his misharsim, if he has people who are in his employ, who live in his home, and they eat by his table, there are samach al shulchanoi, he covers them as well. Now, understand what this means. This means also that if there is one of the Bnei Bayis, let's say there's an adult child, let's say there's a 20-year-old who lives at home, and he goes during the day and he learns in yeshiva, but he is samach al shulchanoi, he lives in the house and he eats from his father's table, he's supported completely by his father, he might be in yeshiva learning second seder when the father goes ahead and lights Neres Chanukah. And yet, he is covered by his father's lighting of the menorah. He doesn't have to be present. He doesn't have to hear the bracha. He doesn't have to say amen. Nothing. Since he is a member of his father's household, and his father lit the menorah at the proper time, in the proper way, in the proper place, his chiyuv of hadlakas Neres Chanukah was covered, because he doesn't really have a chiyuv of hadlakas Neres Chanukah. He has a chiyuv of Ner Chanukah. His chiyuv of Ner Chanukah is covered by his father, the head of his household, lighting. Okay. Now, the question becomes, what happens if you have somebody who is in kind of a gray area? What's the case? So let's start Sif Aleph. Achsanoi, you have a guest. She'ein madlikin alav beveisai, where he does not have a household where anybody is lighting for him. So let's make a hypothetical situation over here. You have a fellow who is single, he lives alone, he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have children, he doesn't really have a household. Right now, he might have, let's say, an apartment in Brooklyn. He left his apartment in Brooklyn, and he's an achsanoi. He's a guest by somebody. So he's hanging out in Lakewood for 2 months. He's hanging out at a house in Lakewood. Okay, he's an achsanoi. She'ein madlikin alav beveisai. He does not have a household where anybody is lighting for him. and instead he is in somebody else's home. In our hypothetical case, he's in somebody else's home in Lakewood. What happens to him? Now, let's realize, if this person wants to be Mekayim the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah, Mahadrin, Mina Mahadrin, so he'll go get a menorah, and he'll light his own menorah. Precisely where he should light his menorah, okay, fine. That'll be a shaila for another day in another siman, perhaps. Precisely where he should light the menorah. But if he wants to light his own Chanukah menorah, and he wants to be Mekayim the mitzvah Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, which according to the Ramah means that every individual lights on his own and adds a new licht every night. Remember, the Mechaber didn't hold that way. The Mechaber held that Mahadrin and Mahadrin is that still only one member of the household lights, but lights an additional ner each night. But we paskin like the Ramah. Mahadrin and Mahadrin means each individual lights his own menorah and adds an additional ner every night. So if this Achsenoi wants to be Mekayim the mitzvah Mahadrin and Mahadrin, so he'll go get his own menorah, he'll light his own menorah. But let's say he's not looking to be Mekayim Mahadrin and Mahadrin. He just wants to know that he was Yoitza, the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. Now again, he doesn't have a household. Nobody is lighting for him back home. He doesn't have a back home. Or even if he has a back home, the home is empty. There's nobody there that's lighting for him. So he's not covered by his household. Okay, he's a guest staying somewhere else. Could he be covered by that household? That's the case that the Mechaber is addressing here. And the Mechaber says, a guest who is not being covered by his own household, he has nobody lighting for him. If he had a home back in Flatbush in Brooklyn, and his wife was home, and his kids were home, and his wife was lighting a menorah in his house, so then he would be covered by the lighting that's going on in his own household. Even though he's not home, even though he doesn't hear the brachas, even though he's not saying amen, even though he's never going to see that menorah, doesn't matter. It's like the case that I said before, the yeshiva bacher who is in the Bismedrash learning second seder, and his father lights the menorah at home. The father's lighting covers the son, not for Mahadrim and Mahadrim, but for the Iker mitzvah of Chanukah, Ner Ishu Beisai. The father lights the menorah at home. He's the head of the household. He covers all of the Bnei Bayis. But this Achsenoi that the Mechaber is discussing over here does not have a household. He doesn't have anybody, a wife, children, who are lighting on his behalf back home. He doesn't have that. He is by somebody else's house in Lakewood. And we want to know, does the lighting going on in that household cover him? Is he now considered a part of that household? And when the head of the household lights, it covers his chiv. Says the Mechaber, no. A guest who's in a situation where nobody back home is lighting on his behalf, tzarich loses pruta labal habayis. He has to give a coin. A pruta was a small copper coin in the days of Chazal. It was a very, very small denomination. But he has to give at least a pruta. He has to give something to the balabayis, to the head of the household where he's staying. Lehishtatef imai, to become a partner with him. Bashemen shel ner Chanukah. He has to become a partner together with the balabas where he's staying, so that he should be covered by his lighting. Now, the Ran in Masechta Shabbos, the Ran says that the chiddush over here is that this person has a chiyuv at all. Very interesting way that the Ran looks at it. The Ran seems to say, the chiyuv of Ner Chanukah is on a household. This person does not have a home. He doesn't have a household. He's a guest by somebody else. So the Ran says, I would have thought that this person maybe doesn't have a chiyuv at all. Kind of like the chiyuv of mezuzah, right? If you don't have a house, if you don't own a house, you're not renting a house, you don't have a chiyuv of mezuzah. So, says the Ran, I might have thought a person doesn't have a home, he doesn't have a household, he's an achsenoi, he's a guest somewhere else. Maybe he doesn't even have a chiyuv of ner Chanukah at all. Maybe he has no chiyuv at all that has to be covered. So the Ran says this Sif over here in Shulchan Aruch is based on a memoir of Rav Sheshes in the second parak of Shabbos. The Ran says the chiddush of Rav Sheshes is that this person does have a chiyuv. Even though he doesn't have a household, he still has a chiyuv of Neres Chanukah. How's he going to cover his chiyuv? He's not automatically covered by the lighting that's going on where he's a guest, because he's only a guest. He's really not B'nai Bayis. He's really not a member of the household, and therefore the head of the household's lighting doesn't cover him. So what does he need to do, says the Mechaber? Tzarech lehishtatef. He's tzarech lasis pruta labalabayis. He has to give some money to the head of the household, lehishtatef imoy, to join with him, bashemen shel ner Chanukah, with the Chanukah licht, so that he should be covered with the Baal HaBayis's lighting. Okay, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. It says the Mishnah Berurah is cut now. So right away, the Mishnah Berurah gives us another case. Let's say you have a yeshiva bacher. I gave you one case. A yeshiva bacher who lives at home, and he's samach al shulchan aviv. He's supported by his father, but he happens to be learning second seder in the Bismedrash when his father lights. He's covered by his father's lighting. But now, says the Mishnah Berurah, how about the case that would go on in Europe, pre-war Europe? What would happen? Yeshiva Bachram would leave home. They would go far away to a strange town. The yeshivas didn't have dormitories necessarily, so the yeshiva would put up Bachrim by local balabatim. So now you have this yeshiva Bachar who's living by a local balabas, and maybe he's even eating by the local balabas, or maybe he's buying his own food and eating his own food in the house of the local balabas. So he has a bed by a local balabas, and he brings his food. Maybe he eats in his room, or maybe he even eats by their dining room table, but he eats his own food. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you have a bacher that's away from home for an extended period of time, and therefore he's not covered by his father's lighting at home. In the case that I gave you, the bacher lives at home and he eats his father's food. He's samach al shulchan aviv. He's covered by his father's lighting, even if he happens not to be at home. But that's not the case of this bacher that the Mishnah Berurah is discussing. This bacher is away from home for an extended period of time. Maybe he's away from home for the entire winter's man. Maybe he left Rosh Chodesh El and he's not coming back until Pesach. So he's gone for an extended period of time. He's taking care of himself. He's staying by a local balabas. He can't be covered by his father's lighting at home when he hasn't been there for 6 months. Is he covered by the lighting of the balabas? Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. This is identical to the achsanoi that the Mechaber is talking about. He would have to give coins. He would have to give some money to the balabas to cover himself. He has to at least go ahead and give the balabas a couple of cents to be included in his lighting. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, this is only true if he's taking care of his own food. But if he mamish lives by this balabas and he eats by this balabas as his table, he's supplied with food by this balabas, then he becomes one of the b'nei bayis. If he's one of the b'nei bayis, then he is covered by the balabayis' lighting. Then hu b'chlal b'nei beisai. For who adin misharsav. So too the servants of the balabas. Kevin chem smuchen al shulchanei b'kvius, since they always live in the house of the balabas, and they're fully supported by the balabas b'kvius, on a permanent basis. Medina ain't sarach lahadlik. They're not required to light on their own. They are covered by the balabayas. Ela imkein roitza liyais v'na mahadrin. But again, in all of these cases, it's only negeya if you're just trying to be mekayim the chiyuv of Neres Chanukah. You want to do mahadrim in a mahadrin, kol hakavod, go get a menorah and go light your own menorah and be mekayim the mitzvah of mahadrim and mahadrin. What we're discussing over here is if you're not doing mahadrim in a mahadrin and you're just striving to be mekayim your chiyuv of Neres Chanukah, what do you need to do? I've cut and bays. We're discussing over here in Achsanoi she'ein madlikin alav bevesai, where they're not lighting for him back at home. He does not have a household back at home where somebody is lighting and covering his chiyuv. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, Ki midina kishe ishtay madlekes der Chanukah bebeisai, because by ikar adin, if he does have a home back wherever, and his wife or one of his adult children are lighting at home, yaitzi hu yaitzi yidei chayvasai pad lakasa. His chiyuv of Neres Chanukah is covered by his wife lighting, afshu b'makom rachik mibeisai, even though he's far away, because like I said in the Hakdama, really the chiyuv is on the household. So it's very nice that he's not at home. But if his wife is at home and his wife is lighting at home, then his wife's lighting covers his chiyuv. Then there's no need for him to give any money to the balabas where he's staying. His chiyuv is covered by his home. The only time we have an issue over here that the Mechaber is discussing is when there is no home that he's covered by. There is no wife that's lighting for him. He doesn't have a home, and he's staying in somebody else's home. That's when he's not covered by the balabayas, because he's not a permanent member of the balabayas' household. And therefore, if he's not going to light on his own to be Mekai Mahadrim and a Mahadrin, and he wants to be covered by the balabayas, he has to be Vishtati V'Imoy B'Priti. He has to give him a couple of cents to join in his lighting. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. V'ayin b'taz, take a look at the Taz b'shem Marshal. The dafke kishu yedeh bebiru she'ishtay madlekes olav. The Taz says, this that we say, that this person, let's say he does have a home, and we said he's covered by his wife's lighting, says the Taz, that's only if he's 100% certain that his wife is going to be lighting and will cover his chiyuv. But if he's not 100% sure, yesh lo lahadlik, he should make his own licht, the gam levarich, and he could even make a bracha. Now this is very, very interesting. How's he making his own bracha? If there's a suffix involved here, if there's a suffix that his wife might be lighting on his behalf, then how can he make a bracha? Suffix brachas lahakal. It's not only suffix brachas lahakal, maybe it's peklala bracha shein tzvicha. If he knows he left his wife at home, and his wife is going to light for him, or if he even has a suffix that his wife is going to light for him, how could he light? So the answer is going to become apparent. Let's go a little further in the Mishnah Berurah. Umitam zeh, and based on the same rationale, mi shelo yada shehidliku olav. Let's say somebody is coming home late. So the Zman Hadlaka, let's say it was 4:30 in the afternoon. This person was late at work. He's not coming home till 8, 9 o'clock at night. He comes home 9 o'clock at night. Umatza shehidliku olav. And he comes home and he sees a menorah burning. So now he knows that while he was away, his wife went ahead and sinned licht. She went ahead and lit Chanukah menorah. Now, again, really, he could be covered by his wife's lighting. So could this guy now go to sleep and say, oh, all is fine and dandy. Baruch Hashem, my wife lit. Her lighting covered me. I'm done. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. Umitam zeh, mi shelo yada shehidliku olav. If he did not know when he was late at work that his wife lit for him, he comes home that night, and he finds out that, yeah, she did light, he still has to light. Why? Since at 4:30 he didn't know that his wife was lighting for him, so what was he thinking? What was he thinking? When he was at work, what was he thinking? Was he thinking, I'm good, I know my wife is going to light for me? If that was the case, if he knew for sure that his wife was lighting for him, then he's covered. But if he was driving home at 10 o'clock at night and he was wondering, did my wife light for me? Did my wife not light for me? And then he came home and he found out that she did, he has to light. Why? Because if he was not sure that his wife lit for him, that means that in his mind he was thinking that he at least maybe might have to light for himself. In that case, he wasn't yotzer with his wife's lighting. Now he has the chiyuv d'Rabbanan to light. The The Taz says that he should mamish light with a bracha. So basically what this Taz is saying is like this. The Taz is saying, the Mechaber over here told us that a guest who is not covered by the lighting of his Bnei Bayis, a guest who does not have anybody lighting for him at home, he has to at least join with the balabas where he's staying to be covered by the balabas's lighting, or he could do mahadrim and a mahadrim, he can light on his own. But the diuk is, if his wife is lighting for him, then he doesn't have to do any of this. He's covered by his wife's lighting, because the chiyuv is neri shubeisai. And if his wife lit back at home, so his home was covered, and he was covered. Says the Taz, that's only true if he knew for sure that his wife was lighting for him. If he did not know for sure that his wife was lighting for him, then he cannot rely on the fact that he's going to be covered by his wife, and instead he should have in mind that he's not covered by his wife, and in that case he could go light with a bracha. Because now it's not a suffix bracha, there's no suffix. If I make up my mind that I don't want to be covered by my wife's lighting, then I'm talking not covered. And that's why he says over here, same thing. You're late at work and you don't know if your wife lit for you. When you came home, you still had a suffix, then you're not covered by your wife's lighting. Because if you didn't know that you were covered by your wife's lighting, so you didn't have das to be covered by your wife's lighting, because you never knew that your wife was going to light for you. So then you still have a chiyuv to light. And then you would light with a bracha. Okay, Ice Cut and Gimel. Law says pruta. He has to give a pruta to the balabais. He has to give the balabais a couple of cents to join in his lighting. Hainu she'ed tzarachach sanoi litein kolchatzi oitzah sanei reis rak bepruta sagi. When the Mechaber says that he could give a pruta, what the Mechaber means to point out is, how much does he have to give? You might think, listen, I want him to cover me as part of the chiyuv. Maybe I have to give 50%. So the Mishnah Berurah says, when the Mechaber says that he could give a pruta, what he means to say is you can even give a small amount. You don't have to cover 50% of the expense. Because once you give him something, so he was already makded to you, he already gave over to you a portion in the oil of the licht, and you're covered by his lighting. But there are those achrayim that write that the balabas has to actually add oil on behalf of the guest. The balabas himself had to make sure that he has enough oil in the nair to burn for a half hour. Now there's an achsanoi that wants that he should cover him. He has to actually add oil. Now, some of the poskim say that the reason for this is that if the balabas doesn't actually add oil, then there's no way to know that he actually had in mind to cover the guest. Maybe it was, sure, you covered. If he adds oil, then we know it's burning longer than it would have. So obviously, he covered him. There are some poskim that say that the guest has to actually give another half hour of oil. In other words, he has to cover his half hour chiyuv. How's he going to cover his half hour chiyuv? By giving enough money to cover another half hour. We don't paskin that way, apparently, but there are those that say that. There also is an opinion that the reason why you have to be mishtatif beprite, the reason why you have to give some money to the balabas, is because you're mechuyev to spend something on the Presumei Nisa. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, he clearly doesn't paskin that way, the Mishnah Berurah, he says, even if the balabais gives you the shemen as a matana, he says, you don't have to pay me. I'll give you some of the oil as a matana, and you're a shutef with me in the Neres Chanukah. That's also good. And now the kicker, this last line of Chelik Gimel here, says the Chavetz Chaim, Ubikam Mokayim, after this whole sprach, and this whole discussion of being mishtatif bepriti and everything else, im yesh lach senoi ner, if the guest has his own menorah, nachin yosel lahadik ba'atzmoi. Certainly, it would be better that he should go ahead and he should light by himself. You know why? Mahadrim and a mahadrin. Like the Sharetzian says in Ice Cotton Yud, nowadays everybody does Mahadrim and a Mahadrim. What are you going ahead and chipping in with the Balabayas? People are going to see that you're not lighting a menorah. They're going to be choshed you that you didn't take care of your chiyuv of their Chanukah. Because nowadays it's unheard of. And nowadays everybody does Mahadrim and a Mahadrim. So someone's going to see you're there, you didn't light a menorah, what's the matter with you? They're going to be choshed you that you don't believe in their Chanukah somehow. You're not being kind the mitzvah. You're going to say, what are you, I was Mishtatif Pepriti. Mishtatif Pepriti? Who's Mishtatif Pepriti? We do Mahadrim and a Mahadrim. Everybody lights their own. He gives a couple of cents to become a shutif in the Balabayis' licht. Says the Chavetz Chaim, you should realize that this case, this halacha applies even if the achsenoi eats by his Balabayis' table. So kind of he's being supported by the Balabayis. He eats his food by his table. Doesn't matter. He still has to be mishtatif pepriti. Lo yamrinu de kibnei beisai dami. He doesn't become like a bnei bayis. Umidina dai bnei echad lekulam. You would have thought that if he's samach al shulchani, he becomes a bnei bayis, and he's automatically covered by the balabayis. No. Kevin de eireyachu, since he's a guest, the einoi samach al shulchani b'kvius. See, here's the difference between this case and the yeshiva bacharim in Mishnah Berurah Katan Aleph. The yeshiva bacharim in Ois Katan Aleph, they become bnei beisai of the balabayis because they're there for an extended period of time and they eat by the balabayis' table b'kvius. If they eat by the balabayis' table, if the balabayis is supplying them with food. If the balabayis is not supplying them with food, they don't become bnei bayis. And like the Mishnah Berurah said in Ois Katan Aleph, they, like the achsanai, have to be mishtatif pepriti. They have to give money to the balabayis. But if they do eat by the table of the balabayis that they're staying by, since they're there for 6 months at a time, they're there b'kvius, they become bnei bayis. But this achsanoi is not somebody that's there b'kvius. He's there for a week. He's there for 2 weeks. He's not there b'kvius. So he's a guest. He has to be mishtatif pepriti. And the last line of Ois Katan Daled, v'tzarich ha'achsanoi l'shmaya habrachas mi balabayis. The achsanoi that's being mishtatif bepriti, he can't go ahead, give the balabayis a quarter to be mishtatif in his Neres Chanukah, and then say, bye-bye, I'm going to the Beis Medrash to learn Second Seder, and your lighting will cover me. No. The real B'nai Beisai, the people who are really members of his household, they could go to the Beis Medrash, and they don't have to be present when the balabayis is lighting. But this guy is not a real b'nei bayis. He's being mishtatif bepriti. He has to be there and he has to hear the brachas. Okay. Now let's go further. Bottom line here in the Shulchan Aruch Kuf Ben Vav Amud Aleph. Now there's a caveat. V'im yesh loy pesach pasuach la'atzmai tzarich lahadlik bepischai. Let's say this person is a guest, but he's not just a guest who's living in the balabayis' house and the balabayis gave him a bed. He has kind of like his own apartment. He has a room in the house, and his room has a separate door to the Rishus HaRabim. In that case, says the Mechaber, Im yesh lo pesach pesuach, if he has his own doorway, tzarich lahadlik bepischai, he has to light in his doorway. Afal pi she'oisei bayis eina miyuchid ela l'sheina, and this is true even if he only uses the room that he has by the balabayis to sleep. V'hu oichel al shulchan balabayis, and he eats by the balabayis' table, the balabayis' food. Doesn't matter. He has to light his own menorah, he has to light his own ner by his doorway. V'hu adin lebena oichel eitzel aviv, and the same halacha would apply in the same scenario if you have a son, an adult son, living in his father's house, but he has his own door going outside to the Rishus HaRabim. Even though he's a son, and even though he's Samach al Shulchan Aviv, he has his own door, he has to light. Says the Mishnah Berurah, back at Kuf Ben Vav Amud Aleph, Ois Katan Hey, V'im yesh lo. If he has his own door, all bets are off. He can't be mishtatif bepriti. He has to light his own licht. Even if he's samach al shulchan of the balabayis, he's got to light his own licht. Why, says the Mishnah Berurah? Hatam mishum chshada. Because now we have a problem of chshad. Sheyichoshtu aisai shlo hidlik ner Chanukah. he has a door going to the Rishus Harabim. Remember, the perspective of the Mechaber, where do you light? You light by your door. Even maybe inside the door, but you light by the door. This guy's got his own door. If he's got his own door, and there's no menorah by his door, people are going to be chayshid him. So then, even though he's a guest, and even if he was mishtatif bepriti, and even if he's samach al shulchan balabayis, and even if he's a son living in his father's house, and samach al shulchan aviv, but he's got his own door, he's got a light because of chshad. Even if this guest has a wife back at home who's lighting for him, he still has to light his own menorah. Why? Because of chshad. Even if this door that he has going to the Rishus Harabim is on the same side of the house as the Balabayas' door. We learned earlier that if you have a house that has two doors and they're both open to the same side, you could light by one, you don't necessarily have to light by the other. Because, people see the menorah over there. So they know, okay, you lit over there. Over here, this guy's a guest at somebody's house. People always see him coming and going through that second doorway. They realize that there's another resident living in the house by that doorway. If there's no menorah, they're going to be chayshid him. So even though it's opened on the same side, and the balabayis lit by the other door, we're worried people know there's a guest who uses that door. They say he didn't light. If he has his own doorway. The implication for the mechaber is if the guest does not have his own doorway, even if he has his own room in the Balabayas' house, he could use the eitzah of giving some money to the Balabayas and joining in his Ner Chanukah. So, what's the Mishnah Berurah pointing out here? Nice cut and zayin. He's saying, the Mechaber said like this: an achsenoi who's not covered by somebody back at home, he could be mishtatif with the Balabayas by giving him some money. And now he covers his ikar chiyuv of Neres Chanukah. If he has his own door, then all bets are off. He's got to light his own menorah. Why? Because of chshad. Okay, now let's take another case. The achsenoi is a guest in this household, and he has his own personal room in that house, but he doesn't have his own door going out to the Rishus Harabim. The implication is that he could be mishtatif bepriti, or if he has a wife back at home lighting for him, his wife could cover him, and he's okay. Says the Mishnah Berurah, "V'yesh paiskim shesayvrim t'chol zeh b'zman Gemara." There are paiskim that say that that's only true back in the day of Chazal. Shahayu madlikin bepischei abatim u'bachatzeros, when people lit in the doorways and people lit in the chatzeros, in the courtyards. But nowadays, when people light inside, in other words, what the Mishnah Berurah is saying is like this: the implication of the mechaber is that if you have your own doorway to the exterior of the house, that's when you have a chshad problem. If you have your own doorway, you got to light your own menorah, because if you don't light your own menorah, people are going to be chayshid that you weren't yotzei the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. There are paiskim that say, v'yesh paiskim shesayvrim, says the Mishnah Berurah, that's only in the days of Chazal. In the days of Chazal, the critical question was whether or not you had your own doorway going to the exterior of the house, because that's where people looked to see if there was a menorah. So if you had your own doorway, you got a light. Even though you have a wife back at home, even though you were mishtatif bepriti, you have your own doorway, you got a light. Because that's the critical thing. The critical thing is the doorway. People see a doorway, they see you going in and out of that doorway, they don't see a menorah, they're going to be chayshid you. Says the Mishnah Berurah, yesh paiskim shesayvrin, there are paiskim that say that's only in the days of Chazal, when the critical question was the doorway to the exterior of the house. But nowadays, when everybody lights inside the house, kol orchim, all guests, hainu afilu nasui, even a married guest, who knows for sure that his wife back home is lighting, He always has to light his own menorah. Because they're not looking at a doorway to see if he's lighting. They're looking, do you have a menorah? If they see that he doesn't have a menorah, they don't realize that, he has a wife back at home that's lighting for him. They're going to be chayshin. What's with this guest? What's the matter with him? He doesn't believe in Neres Chanukah. Daddy, how come the Pliny, the guest, isn't lighting Neres Chanukah? And to give the balabayas money also doesn't cover you. Because since the minig nowadays is we do mahadrin. Everybody lights their own menorah. Also, people in the household see this nuts not lighting a menorah. They'd be chayshin. The Magen Avram concludes, we don't have to be so machmir. Only if he has his own room. If he has his own room, he should be machmir. But Mishnah Berurah says, look back at what I wrote at the end of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Gimel. That was, I said, the punchline is the last line of Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Gimel. When we come makom im yesh lachsanay ner, nachan yosel ladik batzmai. We always do mahadrin and mahadrin, for crying out loud. Have your own menorah. So that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here, v'ayin le'el b'sayv sif Katan Gimel shekasavnu the kishesh ner, nachan yosel ladik batzmai. V'ayin le'el b'sif tafrei shayin vav sif Katan vav sheivenu kama paiskim shesayvrin the kishu samach alan shebeisai. When somebody's relying on the people back at home to light for him, even though you are yoitza, you're relying on your wife lighting for you back at home. But if you walk out at night outside in the street and you see Neres Chanukah, we brought down the poskim that say, you should make a bracha of Shasanisim on Berchas Haroyeh when you see the Neres Chanukah. Since you didn't light your own menorah, even though you were covered by your wife at home, make a Shasanisa when you see a menorah. Valkain. And since we have those paiskim, so we have this open question, certainly Nachan Yosel Lahadik Ba'atzmai, I feel in there, Echad, at least light one there. V'loi lisbay chal kulazu, don't rely on the balabayas. V'ayel kamei b'sif gimel, ma'ashe nichtov bazeh. So if you have your own doorway, tzarech lahadlik, ois katan ches, v'kevin de bazeh ha'adlaka ein elo mishum chshada. But since this lighting is only because of chshad, yeshayim, there are those that say the lo yavarech, you shouldn't make a bracha im yedeh shamadlikin alav bevesai if you know that people at home are lighting on your behalf. But if there's no one back at home lighting for you, you have to make a bracha. Better still, this person should clearly have in mind that I don't want to be yotze with my wife's lighting, and he should light his own menorah. Ice cut and test. The guy has his own doorway. Alpha Pisha say bias, even though he's only using his room for sleeping, still he has to light. Time of the reason is since he has his own doorway, his own room, and he's always going there to sleep. Everybody sees him going in and out of this doorway to the house. It would be a shot if he doesn't light. Ice cut and yud, the same halacha would apply to a son that's eating in his father's house, but he has his own room and his own doorway. There's a chshad. Even though he always eats by his father's table. Kevin datam yishom chshad. Ice cut and yud aleph, that's already the Ramah. So we're going to stop over here with the words of the Ramah. But Baruch Hashem, we covered a good part of that page, so hopefully we covered some ground. Okay, thank you so much for joining me for Liman HaTorah. The schus of Liman HaTorah should be Megan against Klai Yisrael, the Ranshim should send Yeshuas, Refuas, Parnasa, Cheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeicher to see the B'yas Kal Tzedek, B'meher V'yameinu, Amen. Be well.